Number 1. Jeffrey Dahmer. It's one thing when a criminal shocks their neighborhood. It's another when their name echoes across the entire world. For decades, Jeffrey Dahmer has remained the most notorious serial killer in the United States, not just because of what he did, but because of how long he got away with it. His case has been retold in courtrooms, documentaries, and dramatizations, and yet every time, it still feels like the first chilling discovery of a secret that should have never stayed hidden for so long. Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1960. His early years seemed quiet from the outside. His father was a chemist, his mother struggled with health issues, and Jeffrey was the kind of boy who rarely raised his voice. Teachers remembered him as withdrawn, often sitting alone, keeping to himself. Neighbors thought he was polite, though a little odd. Behind closed doors, he was already slipping into a world of isolation. By the time he reached high school, he was drinking heavily, skipping classes, and wandering the streets at night. Friends who did know him spoke later about how he often joked about dark things, but most brushed it off as teenage rebellion. No one realized those small warning signs were leading toward one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history. In 1978, at just 18 years old, Dahmer committed his first known killing. It was a shocking beginning because he had only graduated from high school weeks earlier. But the crime went unnoticed for years. After that, his life seemed to spiral. He dropped out of college, was discharged from the Army, and drifted from job to job. To his family, he appeared troubled, but not outwardly dangerous. He even lived with his grandmother for a time, attending church and helping around the house. It gave the illusion that he was trying to build some kind of normal life. All the while, the truth was much darker. Through the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Dahmer continued to kill. He lived in an apartment building on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, where his quiet behavior kept suspicion low. Neighbors occasionally complained of strange smells, and there were incidents where men ran from his apartment terrified, but nothing stuck. Police even visited the building on several occasions, but Dahmer always had explanations: spoiled meat, fish gone bad, or just private arguments. Because he was calm and polite, the officers often left without looking further. It is now one of the most haunting aspects of the case: how close authorities came to uncovering the truth, only to walk away. Everything unraveled in the summer of 1991. On July 22nd, a man named Tracy Edwards managed to escape from Dahmer's apartment, running into the street and flagging down police. He led officers back to Dahmer's apartment, insisting that something horrifying had been happening inside. When police entered, they expected a minor domestic disturbance. Instead, they stumbled upon evidence that would shock the world. Photographs, remains, and personal belongings of multiple victims were found throughout the apartment. The quiet, polite neighbor was suddenly revealed as one of the most prolific serial killers in modern American history. The investigation revealed that Dahmer had killed 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. The sheer number of victims was staggering, but what really held the public's attention was how openly he spoke once arrested. Unlike many who deny or downplay their actions, Dahmer sat with detectives and laid out his crimes in detail. His calm tone during those interviews added a chilling quality, as if he didn't fully comprehend the devastation he had caused. The trial began in January 1992 in Milwaukee. Dahmer faced 15 counts of killing, with evidence that was overwhelming and undeniable. His defense team attempted to argue insanity, claiming his behavior was driven by mental illness. The prosecution countered that he knew exactly what he was doing, carefully luring victims, hiding evidence, and misleading authorities. Over the course of weeks, the jury listened to testimony from experts, family members, and survivors. The nation watched every development on live television. In February 1992, Dahmer was convicted on all counts. The judge handed down a sentence of 15 consecutive life terms, totaling over 900 years behind bars. Prison life for Dahmer was complicated. At first, he was kept in isolation for his own safety. Eventually, he was moved into the general population, where he became a strange figure. Reports said he spent time quietly reading the Bible, at times expressing remorse for his actions. Other inmates, however, viewed him as someone who thrived on notoriety. That tension ended violently on November 28, 1994, when Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate inside Columbia Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. Just like that, his life ended behind the same walls where he was supposed to spend the rest of his days. Even decades later, Jeffrey Dahmer's name still sparks debates and documentaries. Part of it is the scale of his crimes. Part of it is the way he blended into ordinary life, hiding in plain sight for years while neighbors, police, and even family had no idea what was happening. And part of it is how he seemed to acknowledge his own guilt without ever offering a real answer to why he did what he did. In the end, Dahmer's story is more than the sum of its horrifying details. It's also about the failures that let him slip through the cracks, police who missed warning signs, a community that didn't press harder about the strange smells, and a justice system that only caught him because one man was brave enough to escape and speak out. Without Tracy Edwards, Dahmer might have continued even longer. For those reasons, Dahmer remains the most infamous U.S. serial killer of the modern era. His story is retold not as entertainment, but as a reminder of how far someone can go when they are ignored, underestimated, or dismissed. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how we treat warnings, how justice is carried out, and how much trust we place in appearances. Jeffrey Dahmer's life ended in prison, but the shadow of his crimes continues to hang over true crime history, and that is why his name is always at the top of any list of the most evil serial killers. Number 2, Aileen Wuornos, a hitchhiker on a Florida highway, a pistol in her bag, and a life story that had been unraveling since the day she was born. Aileen Wuornos is often remembered as one of the most infamous female serial killers in America, and her case captured the world's attention not just because of the crimes, but because of the troubled path that led her there. Her trial was televised, her life became the subject of documentaries, and Hollywood even turned her story into an Oscar-winning film. But before all of that, she was simply a child born into hardship, searching for stability she never found. Aileen was born in Rochester, Michigan in 1956. Her father was imprisoned for violent crimes and later died in custody, while her mother abandoned her at a young age. Aileen and her brother were raised by their grandparents, but their home was far from safe. Reports later described her childhood as one filled with neglect and abuse. By her teenage years, Aileen had been thrown out of the house and was living on her own. She survived by hitchhiking, doing odd jobs, and eventually turning to prostitution. To those who knew her, Aileen was unpredictable, sometimes friendly, other times volatile. She carried anger from her past like a heavy weight, and it often boiled over in violent confrontations. In late 1989, that anger would take a deadly turn. Aileen shot and killed a man named Richard Mallory, a store owner in Florida who had picked her up while she was hitchhiking. She later claimed it was in self-defense after he attacked her, but investigators would eventually tie her to a string of other killings that didn't fit the same explanation. Over the course of 1 year, 6 more men were found dead across Florida highways. Each had been shot, and many had last been seen with Aileen. The similarities between the cases began to form a clear pattern. By mid-1990, police knew they were dealing with a serial offender. Witnesses reported seeing a woman matching Aileen's description driving victims' cars. In some cases, she even pawned items that belonged to the men, leaving behind fingerprints and paperwork. A major break came when police traced one of the victim's cars to Aileen and her partner, Tyria Moore. Surveillance, tips, and mounting evidence all pointed toward Aileen, who was soon placed at the top of Florida's most wanted lists. Her arrest came in January 1991 at a biker bar in Volusia County. Detectives closed in and took her into custody without incident. The turning point came when investigators persuaded her partner, Tyria, to cooperate. Police set up recorded phone calls in which Tyria pleaded with Aileen to confess, fearing she herself might be blamed. In those conversations, Aileen admitted her role in the killings, telling Tyria she had done it all to protect them both. The tapes gave prosecutors what they needed. Aileen's trial for the killing of Richard Mallory began later that same month. The courtroom was packed, with reporters from around the country covering every development. Prosecutors argued that the murder was premeditated, part of a pattern of luring men under the guise of prostitution and then shooting them. The defense claimed self-defense, pointing to Aileen's history of being assaulted on the road. The jury didn't buy it. On January 27, 1992, she was found guilty of first-degree murder. Over the next year, she would face trials for several of the other killings, each ending in convictions. Altogether, she was sentenced to 6 death penalties, one of the heaviest sentences ever given to a woman in the United States. Her years on death row were as infamous as her crimes. She gave multiple interviews, sometimes showing regret, other times claiming the system was corrupt or that she was being used as an example. The media portrayed her as a symbol of rage, a woman shaped by violence who unleashed violence in return. Documentaries painted contrasting pictures, some showing her as a victim of her past, others as a cold-blooded predator. Public fascination grew even larger when Hollywood released the movie Monster in 2003, with Charlize Theron portraying her in a performance that won the Academy Award. But for Aileen, there was no Hollywood ending. On October 9, 2002, she was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. In her final statement, she spoke of love, religion, and a belief that she would return to Earth one day. Her words, like much of her life, were a mixture of anger and longing, leaving many unsettled by her contradictions. Today, Aileen Wuornos's case remains one of the most studied and debated examples of female violence in America. Was she a product of a broken childhood and years of abuse? Or was she a calculating killer who used her circumstances to justify her actions? In truth, she was likely both. Her life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about how much someone's past can explain their present, and whether society could have intervened long before the highways of Florida turned into crime scenes. What makes her story unforgettable is not just the number of victims, but the way she stood at the center of national attention. A woman whose name still sparks arguments decades later. She left behind no easy answers, only a warning about how early pain and neglect can echo into devastating choices. Number 3, Dennis Rader. There are some criminals who stand out because of their violence, and there are others who stand out because of how long they manage to hide. Dennis Rader falls into the second category. For over 30 years, he lived an apparently normal life in Wichita, Kansas. He was a husband, a father, a church leader, and a city worker who enforced local codes. To neighbors and colleagues, he was orderly, responsible, and polite. What no one knew was that he was also BTK, the self-named serial killer who bound, tortured, and killed 10 people while taunting police and media with cryptic letters. His arrest in 2005 remains one of the most shocking unmaskings in American crime history. Rader was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and raised in Wichita. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary. but he would later admit to harboring disturbing fantasies even at a young age. Teachers saw him as quiet, and friends noticed he craved control. After high school, he served in the U.S. Air Force, married Paula Dietz, and had 2 children. By the 1970s, he was working in home security, and later as a city compliance officer. He was also active in his local church, where he eventually became president of the council. To everyone who knew him, he was the definition of a suburban family man. Behind that mask, Rader began killing. His first known victims were the Otero family in January 1974, parents Joseph and Julie and 2 of their children. Wichita was stunned by the brutality, but no suspect emerged. Within months, a letter arrived at a local newspaper. The writer claimed responsibility, gave details only the killer could know, and signed off with 3 letters: BTK, bind, torture, kill. It was a name that would haunt Kansas for decades. Over the following years, Rader killed again, targeting women in their homes or on the street. Each attack seemed carefully planned, with evidence that he had stalked victims long before striking. After each crime, letters would appear describing what had happened. Sometimes he mailed them to television stations. Sometimes he left them with objects in public places. Police tried desperately to trace the author, but he was meticulous in covering his tracks. Then, after his last known killing in 1991, the letters stopped. Investigators were left with unsolved cases and a nickname that kept residents fearful long after the crime seemed to end. For more than a decade, BTK faded from headlines. Many assumed he had died or been imprisoned for another crime. But in 2004, Wichita suddenly heard from him again. New letters began arriving, complete with puzzles, crime scene mementos, and taunts to investigators. It was as if Rader could not resist the urge to be remembered. Police reopened the investigation with fresh urgency, applying modern forensic tools that had not existed in the 1970s and 1980s. The turning point came in 2005, when Rader sent a floppy disk to a local television station. In one of his letters, he had asked police if a disk could be traced. Investigators responded publicly, suggesting it would be safe, and Rader believed them. Forensic specialists examined the disk and quickly uncovered metadata showing it had been used at Christ Lutheran Church in Wichita. Even more telling, the document was last modified by a user named Dennis. When detectives searched church records, they found Dennis Rader, the church council president, and a man who fit the BTK profile uncannily well. Rader was placed under close surveillance. Around the same time, police quietly obtained a DNA sample from his daughter's medical file. It was compared with genetic material recovered from earlier crime scenes, and the match was decisive. On February 25, 2005, Rader was pulled over and arrested as he drove home. The community that had once trusted him was about to learn the truth. In interviews after his arrest, Rader confessed to the 10 killings with a chilling calmness. He spoke about his crimes as if they were projects he had planned, describing details without emotion. For many, the most disturbing part was how normal he appeared: polite, composed, even cooperative, as though he were discussing routine tasks rather than lives destroyed. His own family was blindsided, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the reality of BTK. The trial was brief because of his admissions. In June 2005, he pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. He gave a graphic courtroom confession, explaining step by step how he had carried out each crime. Those in the courtroom were stunned by his matter-of-fact delivery. In August, he was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole for 175 years. He remains in prison today, serving his sentence at El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. The BTK case continues to fascinate because of the contradictions it revealed. Rader was not a drifter or an outcast, but a trusted figure in his community. He held steady jobs, raised children, and sat in church pews every Sunday. Yet at the same time, he was secretly carrying out one of the longest and most elusive killing sprees in U.S. history. His downfall came not from police brilliance alone, but from his own arrogance, the belief that he could toy with investigators forever without being caught. In the end, Dennis Rader is remembered not only for the crimes themselves, but for the fear he instilled, the decades of unanswered questions, and the shock of discovering that evil had lived so close to home. His case is often studied by criminologists as an example of how a person can compartmentalize their life, presenting one face to the world while hiding another entirely. And it stands as a stark warning that sometimes the most ordinary neighbor can be hiding the darkest secret. Number 4, Anthony Sowell. Sometimes, the most horrifying discoveries are found in the places people pass by every day. On Imperial Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio, stood a rundown house that blended into the rest of the struggling neighborhood. It looked ordinary from the outside, a crumbling building in an area marked by poverty and decline. But in 2009, police would uncover what had been happening inside, and the man who lived there would become one of the most notorious serial killers of modern America. His name was Anthony Sowell, later known to the world as the Cleveland Strangler. Anthony Sowell was born in 1959 and raised in East Cleveland in a household filled with instability. Accounts later described his childhood as deeply troubled. He lived with his mother and grandmother in a crowded home, where discipline was harsh and love was scarce. Neighbors recalled that the children in the house were often unsupervised, left to fend for themselves in an environment that seemed more like survival than a family. Sowell was known to be quiet, a boy who kept to himself. But silence doesn't always mean innocence. The struggles of his early life seemed to plant seeds of anger and control that would later grow in the worst ways. As a teenager, Sowell drifted through school without much notice. In 1978, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps and served for several years, stationed in both North Carolina and overseas. By all accounts, he was a disciplined soldier who earned an honorable discharge in 1985. For a time, his future looked stable. He had served his country, gained training, and returned home with the potential to rebuild his life. But back in Cleveland, things took a darker turn. Sowell struggled to adapt to civilian life, turned to alcohol, and began a pattern of violent behavior. In 1989, he was convicted of a brutal assault and served 15 years in prison. When he was released in 2005, he moved into the house on Imperial Avenue that would later become infamous. The home itself became the center of his world. To neighbors, Sowell was mostly invisible. He lived alone, sometimes inviting women over for drinks. People in the area whispered about him, especially when strange smells began drifting from the property. Sowell explained it away, saying it was spoiled meat from a freezer that had broken, or simply the decay of the old building. The excuses were accepted, and for years, no one looked further. Between 2007 and 2009, Sowell lured women into his home. Most of them were vulnerable, women struggling with addiction, poverty, or homelessness. He would invite them over under the guise of friendship, alcohol, or companionship. But once inside, they never came out. For a long time, no one noticed their absence. Families who raised concerns were told the women had likely disappeared into other parts of the city. Police reports were filed, but little follow-up came. The neighborhood, long ignored and under-resourced, offered few protections for those who were most at risk. Everything changed in October 2009, when one woman escaped his home. She went straight to the police, telling them what she had endured and warning that others might still be inside. At first, officers thought it might be another neighborhood disturbance. But when they entered the house at 1225 Imperial Avenue, they found something no one could have imagined. The discovery was overwhelming. Remains of women were scattered throughout the house, hidden in the basement, tucked in crawl spaces, buried in the backyard, and even left in corners of the house itself. The smell that neighbors had complained about for months, even years, was explained in an instant. In total, the remains of 11 women were found on the property. Each discovery added to the horror, and Cleveland realized it had been living alongside a predator who had gone unchecked for years. Sowell was arrested immediately, but the shock of the case went far beyond his capture. Families of missing women suddenly had answers, but the pain of what had happened to their loved ones was almost unbearable. The community demanded to know how so many complaints, missing persons reports, and neighbor concerns had been ignored. Police admitted that they had been called to the house multiple times but had never investigated thoroughly. The failure to act earlier was seen as one of the reasons Sowell had been able to continue for so long. The trial of Anthony Sowell began in June 2011. He faced 11 counts of aggravated murder, along with dozens of counts of kidnapping and other charges. Prosecutors laid out the evidence in stark detail: the DNA matches, the testimonies of surviving women who had escaped, and the forensic analysis of the home. They described him as a predator who deliberately targeted vulnerable women because he believed no one would look for them. The defense tried to argue that his upbringing and possible mental health issues should be considered, but it was not enough. The trial lasted over a month, with packed courtrooms and national media following every word. Families of the victims sat in attendance, listening as prosecutors described the final days of their loved ones. Sowell himself showed little emotion, often sitting silently as testimony unfolded. On July 22, 2011, the jury found him guilty on 82 of 83 counts. The verdict confirmed what many already knew: that he had preyed on women for years while the system failed to stop him. In August 2011, Sowell was sentenced to death. The judge spoke directly to him, saying his actions had scarred families and torn apart the community. Sowell was sent to death row at Chillicothe Correctional Institution in Ohio, where he would remain for the rest of his life. For the next decade, he filed appeals, but none were successful. In early 2021, before his execution date could be set, Sowell died in prison from a terminal illness. For some, his death brought closure. For others, it felt like he escaped the full weight of justice by dying before the state could carry out his sentence. The story of Anthony Sowell is remembered not only for the scale of his crimes, but for the failures that allowed them to happen. Neighbors had called police about the smell. Families had filed reports about missing daughters and sisters. Survivors had spoken out. Yet for years, nothing was done. His case forced Cleveland to confront issues of neglect, systemic inequality, and the treatment of women living on the margins. Today, the house on Imperial Avenue is gone, demolished in 2011 to erase the physical reminder of what happened there. But for the families of the 11 women, and for the city of Cleveland, the scars remain. Anthony Sowell's name is now a permanent entry in the history of American crime. A reminder that the most terrifying danger can hide in plain sight, and that ignoring small warnings can allow tragedies of unimaginable scale to unfold. Number 5. Lonnie Franklin Jr. Los Angeles has been home to many notorious crime stories, but few stretched across as many years as the case of Lonnie Franklin Jr., the man the media named the Grim Sleeper. His crimes haunted South Los Angeles for decades, earning him his grim nickname because of the long gap in reported killings. For years, families demanded answers, communities cried out for justice, and yet the killer remained free, hiding in plain sight. When he was finally unmasked in 2010, the city learned that one of its own neighbors had been responsible for a series of killings that spanned more than 20 years. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was born in Los Angeles in 1952. He grew up in the city he would later terrorize in a working-class family, and he eventually joined the U.S. Army. During his military service, he was stationed in Germany, where his record was far from clean. After returning to Los Angeles, he found work as a sanitation worker and later as a city mechanic. Neighbors described him as friendly, even helpful. He fixed cars in his driveway, chatted casually with people in his community, and never drew attention to himself. To anyone passing by, he was an ordinary man leading an ordinary life. But beneath the surface, he was carrying out a pattern of violence that would devastate dozens of families. The first killings connected to him took place in 1985. The victims were almost always women from South Los Angeles, many of them struggling with poverty, homelessness, or addiction. Their disappearances rarely made front-page news, and that invisibility made them easy prey. Franklin's ability to blend in with the community gave him cover. Victims were found in alleyways, dumpsters, and abandoned lots, each case connected by similar patterns but with few leads. By 1988, at least 10 women had been killed, but then the killings seemed to stop. For more than a decade, no cases were linked, and the city began to wonder if the killer had vanished, died, or moved away. That long silence earned him the name Grim Sleeper. But the quiet was misleading. Investigators later discovered that he had continued to kill, though not always in ways that made the crimes immediately recognizable. The gap had not been a retirement, just a pause. The investigation into the Grim Sleeper grew into one of Los Angeles's most frustrating cold cases. Detectives struggled with limited evidence, community distrust, and a sense that the victims' lives had not been given the same urgency as other cases. Families of missing women held rallies and demanded accountability, arguing that the police were slow to respond because many of the victims came from disadvantaged backgrounds. This tension hung over the city for years. A breakthrough finally came in 2007, when DNA technology linked several unsolved killings from the 1980s to new cases in the 2000s. Suddenly, the Grim Sleeper was back on the radar, and investigators knew they were dealing with a serial killer who had been active for decades. Still, they didn't know who he was. The crucial moment came through what is called familial DNA testing, a technique that searches for partial matches in databases. In 2010, police got a hit from the DNA of Franklin's son, who had been arrested on an unrelated charge. The partial match led them to Lonnie Franklin Jr. Police began tailing Franklin, waiting for the chance to collect a sample of his DNA. One day, undercover officers followed him to a pizza restaurant. After Franklin finished his meal, they retrieved a discarded plate, utensils, and napkins. Tests confirmed that his DNA matched evidence from multiple crime scenes. After decades of mystery, they had their man. Franklin was arrested on July 7, 2010. The community was stunned. Neighbors described him as someone who waved hello, shared a drink, and tinkered with cars in his yard. No one imagined he was the Grim Sleeper. When police searched his home, they uncovered hundreds of photos of women, many of whom were unidentified, fueling fears that the number of victims could be far higher than what was officially known. His trial began in February 2016, nearly 6 years after his arrest. Franklin faced 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. The prosecution laid out a devastating case built on DNA evidence, witness testimony, and decades of investigative work. Survivors described encounters where Franklin had tried to attack them, but they managed to escape. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial or mishandled, but the jury was unconvinced. In May 2016, Franklin was convicted on all counts. The following month, he was sentenced to death. For many families of the victims, the verdict brought some closure, though the weight of decades without answers remained. The trial also reignited debate about how law enforcement responds to crimes in poor and minority neighborhoods, with many asking whether the grim sleeper could have been caught sooner if the victims had come from different backgrounds. Lonnie Franklin Jr. was housed on death row at San Quentin State Prison, one of the most notorious facilities in the country. In March 2020, he was found dead in his cell at the age of 67. His death was reported as natural causes, though for some it felt like justice had been cut short before the state could carry out his sentence. The story of the grim sleeper is one that lingers not just because of the crimes, but because of what they represented. For over 20 years, a man killed women in a major American city while maintaining the image of a helpful neighbor. He hid in plain sight, and he targeted victims who were often overlooked by society. His case highlights not only the danger of predators who exploit invisibility, but also the systemic failures that let them continue for so long. Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s life ended quietly in a prison cell, but the shadow of his crimes remains. For the families of his victims, his name will always be a reminder of the years stolen from their daughters, sisters, and mothers. For Los Angeles, the case stands as a warning that silence does not mean safety, and that justice delayed can be justice denied. Number 6, Samuel Little. In 2018, the FBI made an announcement that stunned the world. They had identified the most prolific serial killer in American history, a man named Samuel Little. For decades, he had moved quietly from state to state, targeting women who lived on society's margins. His crimes stretched across 4 decades, from the 1970s to 2005. And for years, he escaped notice, slipping through cracks in the justice system. When his story finally came to light, it forced the country to confront not only the scale of his violence, but also how easily vulnerable lives can be ignored. Samuel Little was born in 1940 in Georgia. His early life was marked by instability. He was largely raised by his grandmother and spent much of his youth in and out of trouble. He struggled in school, later describing himself as a child who never quite fit in. By the time he reached adulthood, he was drifting across the country, living a transient lifestyle, often surviving by petty crime. He was arrested dozens of times for offenses ranging from theft to assault, but serious charges rarely stuck. To law enforcement, he was a familiar name but not yet seen as anything more than a small-time criminal. That perception hid the reality. Behind the arrests and relocations, Little was committing killings across the country. He targeted women who were often overlooked by society, those struggling with poverty, homelessness, or addiction. Many were sex workers. Because of this, their disappearances were often underreported, and their deaths sometimes dismissed as accidents or overdoses. Little took advantage of that neglect, confident that the women he chose would not spark major investigations. For decades, his crimes remained largely invisible. When authorities did suspect foul play, Little was able to talk his way out, move on, or exploit a lack of forensic evidence. This pattern continued well into the 2000s. Then, in 2012, his luck finally ran out. He was arrested in Kentucky on a drug charge, and his DNA was entered into a national database. That DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved killings in California in the late 1980s. Investigators realized they might be looking at a serial offender far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Little was extradited to California, where he was charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial in 2014 laid out the evidence in detail: DNA matches, witness testimony, and decades-old case files that now made sense in the light of forensic science. The jury convicted him, and Little was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. But the story didn't end there. From his prison cell, Samuel Little began talking. Investigators pressed him about other unsolved cases, and to their surprise, he started confessing. Not to just a few murders, but to dozens. Over time, his total climbed to 93 killings across 19 states. To help investigators confirm the claims, Little drew sketches of his victims from memory. The portraits, haunting in their detail, became one of the most unsettling pieces of evidence ever produced by a serial killer. Many of the faces were later matched to real women who had been reported missing or found dead decades earlier. The FBI launched a massive effort to verify his confessions, working with local law enforcement agencies across the country. They confirmed at least 60 of the killings, making him the most prolific known serial killer in American history. What shocked many was how consistent his recollections were, even about crimes committed 30 or 40 years earlier. His memory for details, the color of a victim's dress, the street corner where he picked her up, the way she wore her hair, convinced investigators that he was telling the truth. The revelations drew international attention. Documentaries were made, news outlets covered every update, and the FBI released his sketches to the public in hopes of identifying the remaining victims. Families of missing women came forward, some finally finding closure after decades of uncertainty. For others, the sketches were painful reminders of loved ones who had vanished without explanation. Despite his staggering record, Little remained strangely calm in interviews. He often spoke about the killings without remorse, describing them as if they were distant memories with no emotional weight. What made his case especially disturbing was the way he chose his victims. Not randomly, but deliberately targeting those he believed no one would miss. It was a strategy that worked for nearly 40 years, allowing him to kill again and again without serious suspicion. Samuel Little spent the final years of his life in a California prison. He was in poor health, confined to a wheelchair, and still talking to investigators who were trying to close as many cold cases as possible. On December 30th, 2020, he died at the age of 80. His death ended the possibility of more confessions, though the work of linking him to unsolved cases continues. His story is not just about one man's capacity for violence, but about systemic failures. The fact that he was able to kill so many women without being stopped for decades raised questions about how society values certain lives over others. Why were the disappearances of poor women, women of color, and sex workers so easily dismissed? Why did it take until modern DNA technology to connect the dots? These are the haunting questions left behind by his legacy. Samuel Little's name is now etched into history as America's most prolific serial killer. The scale of his crimes is almost beyond comprehension, but what makes his story resonate is not just the numbers. It is the reminder that every one of his victims was a person with a family, a story, and a life that mattered. His case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, equality, and the way we respond to those living on society's margins. By the time the world learned the full extent of his crimes, Samuel Little was already old, frail, and nearing the end of his life. Yet the damage he had done stretched back decades and spanned across the country. For many families, his confessions provided long-awaited answers, but for others, the wounds remain open. In the end, the man who went unnoticed for so long became infamous for exactly how many lives he took while remaining hidden in plain sight. Number 7. Israel Keyes. Some serial killers operate in bursts of violence, while others plan meticulously, calculating every move. Israel Keyes was one of the latter. His name may not be as instantly recognizable as Dahmer or Bundy, but investigators consider him one of the most frightening offenders in modern U.S. history. Between the mid-1990s and 2012, Keyes killed across multiple states, leaving behind almost no trace. What made him especially chilling was not only his crimes, but the way he prepared for them. He buried kill kits across the country, hidden caches of weapons, tools, and supplies, waiting years to use them. When his story finally came out, the FBI called him a serial killer, unlike any they had seen before. Israel Keyes was born in 1978 in Utah, the second of 10 children in a strict religious household. His family moved frequently, eventually settling in a remote part of Washington state. He grew up isolated from mainstream culture, with no television and little outside influence. As a boy, he was known to be quiet, but he was also fascinated by weapons and control. By his teenage years, he was already engaging in troubling behavior, breaking into houses and stealing firearms. After finishing school, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving from 1998 to 2001. Fellow soldiers later described him as disciplined and somewhat detached, a man who kept to himself but rarely caused problems. When he left the Army, he settled in Alaska, working as a contractor and raising a daughter. To those who knew him casually, he seemed ordinary, even dependable. What no one realized was that Keyes had built a double life. Over the years, he began traveling around the United States, but these were not ordinary trips. He carefully selected locations, studying towns he had never visited before. He would bury kits containing duct tape, cash, weapons, and other supplies in hidden spots, sometimes years before he returned to use them. These caches allowed him to strike far from home, with everything he needed already in place. The randomness of his targets made him nearly impossible to trace. His crimes stretched from Vermont to Washington, from New York to Texas. Because he chose victims at random and avoided any clear pattern, investigators struggled to connect the cases. He admitted to at least 11 killings, though the real number may be higher. One of his earliest known crimes was an attack on a couple in Washington state in the late 1990s, but it was not until 2012 that his secret life unraveled. In February of that year, Keyes kidnapped Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old barista in Anchorage, Alaska. He abducted her from the coffee stand where she worked, holding her captive before killing her. Unlike his previous crimes, this one carried mistakes. He left behind evidence and used Samantha's debit card at ATMs across several states. Security footage and bank records gave investigators their first real trail. Weeks later, Keyes was arrested in Texas after a traffic stop, his rental car full of incriminating items. Once in custody, Keyes began to talk, though always on his own terms. He confessed to multiple killings across the country, often giving investigators just enough detail to confirm his claims, but never the full picture. He described traveling thousands of miles to commit crimes in states where he had no personal ties. He revealed the existence of his kill kits, some of which were later found buried where he said they would be. The randomness of his methods terrified law enforcement because it meant there were no easy patterns, no geographic focus, and no clear victim profile. He killed when he wanted to, where he wanted to, and then returned quietly to his ordinary life in Alaska. The FBI called him one of the most methodical serial killers they had ever encountered. They believed his number of victims could be far higher than the 11 he admitted to, possibly dozens. Families of missing people across the country suddenly wondered if their cases were linked to Israel Keyes. His confessions were both a source of answers and of new questions, leaving investigators scrambling to piece together timelines and confirm identities. Keyes was charged with the kidnapping and killing of Samantha Koenig, and prosecutors in Alaska prepared a capital case against him. They intended to seek the death penalty, but Keyes resisted the slow pace of the legal process. He demanded an execution date, insisting he did not want to spend years in prison. In interviews, he came across as cold, detached, and disturbingly matter-of-fact. He showed little remorse, instead focusing on his own frustrations with how long the trial would take. On December 2, 2012, Israel Keyes ended his own life in his jail cell, cutting short the investigation and leaving behind unanswered questions. He left a note filled with rambling thoughts, but no detailed confessions. For the families of victims, his death meant they would likely never learn the full truth of what he had done. For investigators, it was a frustrating end to one of the most complex serial killer cases in U.S. history. Today, Keyes is remembered as one of the most frightening killers, not because of how many victims he had, but because of how he operated. He was disciplined, patient, and calculated, willing to wait years before striking. His kill kits showed a level of preparation rarely seen, and his choice of random victims made him nearly impossible to catch. In many ways, he was the embodiment of the serial killer law enforcement fears the most, the one who doesn't fit the usual profile, who hides behind normalcy, and who leaves no predictable trail. For the families of those he admitted to killing, there is at least some measure of closure. For many others, questions remain. How many lives did he take? How many families are still waiting for answers? Israel Keyes left behind a legacy of fear, not only for his crimes, but for the reminder that some predators are willing to wait in silence, planning until the moment they strike. Number 8. Gary Michael Hilton. Deep in America's forests, where trails wind through quiet trees and hikers vanish into the wilderness, one man turned those peaceful landscapes into hunting grounds. His name was Gary Michael Hilton, later called the National Forest Serial Killer. Between 2007 and 2008, Hilton targeted hikers in southern states, abducting them from public parks and national forests. What makes his story so disturbing is not just the brutality of his crimes, but how he blended into the very landscapes he used to stalk his victims. He was a drifter, a man with no fixed home, and for a time, he seemed invisible. Hilton was born in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia. His childhood was troubled, and as a teenager, he was already showing signs of instability. At one point, he even shot his stepfather during an argument, though the man survived. Despite these early red flags, Hilton drifted into adulthood with little consequence. He served briefly in the Army, but after a medical discharge, he never built a stable life. Instead, he lived on the margins of society, odd jobs, failed relationships, and periods of homelessness. By the time he was in his 60s, Hilton was a familiar face in the forests of Georgia and Florida, often seen with his dog, appearing harmless to the hikers who crossed his path. But appearances hid his true intentions. In January 2008, the body of Meredith Emerson, a 24-year-old hiker, was discovered in the North Georgia mountains. She had been reported missing after going hiking with her dog on New Year's Day. Search teams scoured the forest for days, and it was Hilton who eventually led authorities to her remains after his arrest. Investigators learned that he had abducted her from the trail, held her captive, and then killed her. What shocked many was that Hilton had encountered her in broad daylight, on a trail used by families and hikers every day. Hilton's arrest opened the door to other cases. Once in custody, he began confessing. He admitted to killing Cheryl Dunlap, a nurse and Sunday school teacher in Florida, in December 2007. He also confessed to killing John and Irene Bryant, an elderly couple hiking in North Carolina in late 2007. Authorities linked him to several other disappearances and suspected him in additional killings going back years. The timeline suggested Hilton had used national forests across the South as his hunting ground, taking advantage of remote trails where people vanished without immediate notice. The investigation revealed a man who was both opportunistic and methodical. Hilton carried basic camping supplies, knew the trails intimately, and often posed as a fellow hiker. He approached victims casually, earning their trust just long enough to overpower them. His crimes stretched across multiple states, which initially made it difficult for investigators to connect them. Only after DNA, witness reports, and his own confessions came together did the full scope of his crimes become clear. In 2008, Hilton was tried for the killing of Meredith Emerson in Georgia. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to lead investigators to her body and entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced to life in prison, but that was only the beginning. Later that same year, he was extradited to Florida, where he faced trial for the killing of Cheryl Dunlap. This time, prosecutors pursued the death penalty. The evidence included forensic matches, witness accounts, and Hilton's own admissions. In February 2011, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Hilton's legal troubles continued in North Carolina, where he was indicted for the killings of John and Irene Bryant. The sheer scale of his crimes across multiple states raised questions about whether there were even more victims still unaccounted for. Investigators suspect he may have been active long before 2007, given his transient lifestyle and long familiarity with remote trails. Hilton himself hinted at other crimes, but often refused to give details, leaving unanswered questions scattered across the forests he once roamed. Life in prison did not dull the interest in Hilton's case. The media covered each trial closely, painting him as the embodiment of fear in America's wilderness, a reminder that danger can lurk even in places meant for peace and escape. Hikers and outdoor enthusiasts across the country watched the case unfold with unease, realizing that someone like Hilton could turn a familiar trail into a place of terror. Today, Gary Michael Hilton remains on death row in Florida. His age and health have slowed him, but his legacy continues to cast a shadow. Families of his victims live with the memories of loved ones who never returned from what should have been ordinary hikes. The national forests, once just places of beauty and quiet, carry the weight of the lives stolen there. Hilton's story is chilling, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because of how easily he blended into the environment. He was the man you might pass on a trail, the one who nodded hello as he walked his dog, the one who seemed to belong in the wilderness. And yet, behind that ordinary exterior, he was waiting for the right moment to strike. His case stands as a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, danger can hide in plain sight, disguised as just another traveler on the path. Number 9, Anthony Robinson. In late 2021, police in Virginia uncovered a serial killer hiding in plain sight, a man who lured women online, met them in motels, and then left their bodies in shopping carts. The media quickly dubbed him the shopping cart killer. His real name is Anthony Robinson, and his case has become one of the most disturbing examples of how technology, anonymity, and vulnerability can collide in the worst possible way. Unlike many killers who spend years hiding from attention, Robinson's downfall came rapidly, his crimes pieced together through surveillance cameras and digital trails. Anthony Robinson was born in 1971, making him nearly 50 when his crimes came to light. He had lived a quiet, unremarkable life in Washington, D.C., and later in Virginia. Neighbors described him as reserved, someone who didn't stand out, a man who stayed under the radar. He had no serious criminal history, no background that suggested what was coming. To those who knew him casually, he was just another middle-aged man trying to get by. But online, Robinson was using dating apps to find women he believed no one would look for, women he could lure, trap, and kill. Investigators believe Robinson began his spree in 2021. He met women through dating platforms, arranging meetings at motels in the Virginia area. Once there, he was accused of killing them, then transporting their bodies with a shopping cart. A detail so unusual, it became the defining symbol of his case. Surveillance cameras captured him moving carts through parking lots and alleys, sometimes in the early hours of the morning, pushing the bodies to secluded spots. The cold practicality of his method horrified the public and cemented his nickname in headlines across the country. The investigation began when police discovered the remains of two women in a lot near Harrisonburg, Virginia, in November 2021. Both had last been seen alive in Robinson's company. Detectives quickly focused on him as a suspect, pulling surveillance footage from the motel and surrounding area. The video showed Robinson pushing a cart loaded with what investigators later confirmed were human remains. From there, the evidence began to pile up. Within weeks, more victims were linked to him. Another two women were found in Fairfax County, their bodies hidden in similar circumstances. The pattern was undeniable. Robinson's arrest soon followed, and law enforcement began combing through his digital history. They uncovered records of his conversations with women online, plans he had made, and movements that connected him to crime scenes. In court, prosecutors presented him as a predator who deliberately used technology to target vulnerable women. The defense offered little to counter the overwhelming evidence. The surveillance videos, phone records, and physical evidence all tied Robinson to the killings. Though the full scope of his crimes is still being investigated, he has already been charged in multiple deaths, and police believe there could be more victims. The shock of the case came not only from the brutality of the crimes, but from the ordinariness of the man accused. Robinson had no prior record of violent crime, no history that suggested he was capable of such actions. His ability to operate unnoticed for even a short time highlighted how easily predators can use digital platforms to find victims. It also raised questions about safety in online dating, the vulnerability of marginalized women, and the speed at which trust can be exploited. The trial process for Robinson is ongoing, with prosecutors determined to secure life sentences for each of the victims tied to him. As the investigation continues, authorities are reviewing missing persons cases in areas where Robinson was known to travel. The possibility of additional victims looms large, though definitive answers may take years. For the families of the women already identified, the pain is overwhelming. They describe their daughters and sisters as people searching for connection, for companionship, and instead finding someone who saw them only as opportunities. Their grief has been echoed by communities across Virginia, where the fear of the shopping cart killer spread rapidly after the first bodies were found. Anthony Robinson's case has already become one of the most infamous modern serial killer stories in America, not because of a long history stretching back decades, but because of the immediacy of the evidence. The surveillance footage made his crimes undeniable, giving the public a rare and disturbing glimpse into how he operated. The image of him pushing a cart through a motel parking lot has become a haunting reminder of how evil can appear in the most ordinary forms. As Robinson awaits his full sentencing, the case continues to raise important questions about how technology is used, how vulnerable people are protected, and how killers adapt to the modern world. His story stands as a grim example that serial killers are not just figures of the past, but a reality that still exists in the present, hiding in plain sight until someone looks closely enough to see the truth. Number 10. Derek Todd Lee. In the early 2000s, the city of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, lived in fear of a killer who seemed to strike without pattern, leaving behind little more than confusion and grief. That man was Derek Todd Lee, later known as the Baton Rouge serial killer. Between 1998 and 2003, Lee was linked to a string of murders that terrorized the region, targeting women across neighborhoods that had once felt safe. His capture would reveal not only the brutality of his crimes, but also the flaws in a system that struggled to identify him sooner. Derek Todd Lee was born in 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana. His childhood was marked by instability, with a father who abandoned the family and a mother who raised him largely on her own. As a boy, Lee was remembered as quiet, but often got into trouble. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was already showing signs of aggression, prone to outbursts and fights. Teachers noticed his temper, but few saw it as a sign of something more dangerous. To many, he was simply a troubled kid in a small Louisiana town. As he grew older, Lee struggled to hold down steady work and frequently ran into legal problems. He was arrested multiple times for burglary and assault, and while he served short stints in jail, he always managed to return to the community. He married, had children, and tried to present himself as a family man. But beneath the surface, his violent tendencies were growing stronger. Those who knew him casually saw only an ordinary man. Few could have imagined the secret life he was leading. From 1998 onward, a series of women began disappearing in Baton Rouge. Their bodies were later found in wooded areas, ditches, or abandoned fields. The killings were brutal, but at first, investigators struggled to link them. For years, they operated under the assumption that the killer was white, based on outdated profiling methods. This mistake would cost precious time and allow Lee to continue his spree. He was, in fact, a black man, a fact that would only become clear once DNA evidence began to tell the real story. The breakthrough came in 2002, when investigators recovered DNA at one of the crime scenes. When it was analyzed, the genetic profile did not match any of the suspects being considered, nor did it fit the description the FBI's behavioral profile had suggested. But it did narrow down possibilities. By comparing the DNA to public databases, scientists were able to conclude that the suspect was of African descent. This revelation forced police to reevaluate their assumptions and cast a wider net. By early 2003, suspicion turned toward Derek Todd Lee. Detectives collected a sample of his DNA, and the results confirmed the match. He was linked to at least 7 murders of women in the Baton Rouge area, though authorities believe the true number may have been higher. In May 2003, Lee fled when police came to question him. After a manhunt that stretched across multiple states, he was captured in Atlanta, Georgia. His trial began in 2004, focusing on the killing of Charlotte Murray Pace, one of his confirmed victims. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including DNA, eyewitness testimony, and forensic links. Lee's defense attempted to argue mental illness, pointing to reports of schizophrenia, but the jury was unconvinced. In August 2004, Derek Todd Lee was convicted and sentenced to death. In a separate trial, he received a second death sentence for another killing. Lee spent the rest of his life on death row at Louisiana State Penitentiary, commonly known as Angola. Appeals were filed, but none succeeded in overturning his convictions. In 2016, before the state could carry out the execution, Derek Todd Lee died of heart disease at the age of 47. His death closed the case, but left many families with unanswered questions about the true scope of his crimes. The legacy of Derek Todd Lee's crimes is complex. On one hand, his conviction brought justice for at least some of the families. On the other, the case highlighted major flaws in the investigation. Relying too heavily on traditional profiling had delayed the identification of the killer, allowing him to continue longer than he might have otherwise. The use of DNA evidence became a turning point, not only in this case, but in how law enforcement across the country began to approach serial crimes. For the people of Baton Rouge, the years of fear left scars that are still remembered today. Women lived with the knowledge that someone was hunting in their neighborhoods, and entire communities were shaken by the randomness of his attacks. Derek Todd Lee's case remains one of the most chilling reminders that serial killers are not confined to history books. They can exist in modern times, exploiting every blind spot in the system until they are finally caught. In the end, Derek Todd Lee is remembered not only as a killer, but as a lesson in the dangers of assumption and the importance of science in criminal investigations. His crimes devastated families and communities, but his capture also pushed law enforcement to adapt and modernize. While his life ended behind bars, the impact of what he did continues to echo in Baton Rouge and beyond, a warning about the hidden dangers that can lurk in any city